From the studios of KENW on the campus of Eastern New Mexico University, it's You Should Know, featuring the people and events of Eastern New Mexico and West Texas.
Thank you for joining me today. This is You Should Know. My name's Evelyn Ledbetter, and my guests today are Dr. Don Elder and Dr. Michael Shaughnessy. So welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Pleasure. So you guys have been busy. Just a little bit.
The taxpayers are getting their money's worth out of us, yes.
For sure.
Well, there you go. I just want to start off. I haven't done the interviews with you before. I know you've been on our show before, but and obviously everybody calls you Doc, so I'm going to continue with that. Just a little bit of background information, Doc, on your education, where you grew up, and just let us get to know you some.
Evelyn, I'm originally a Midwesterner, went to high school in Iowa, went to college in Illinois at Northwestern University, got a teaching certificate from the University of Northern Iowa, was a high school teacher in Iowa for 9 years, got my PhD from the University of California, San Diego, taught at a university out in California until 1995. Eastern was nice enough to offer me a job in 95, and I've been here ever since.
Well, we've been very fortunate and blessed to have you since then. So, and Dr. Shaughnessy?
Well, I did my doctoral work at the University of Nebraska up in Lincoln, spent 3 years there, and came down here to Eastern. And again, Eastern was nice enough to give me a position in 1983, and I've been here ever since in various departments and enjoyed my time immensely.
Well, awesome. I never had the pleasure of having a class with either of you, but I may bump in and sit back there and audit one sometime.
We'd be honored.
We'd be great.
My son, I've seen you both as Abe Lincoln. My son met Doc in the classroom, I think, in 4th grade, and he came in, and my son shares a love of history, just as you do, both of you.
Right.
And the relationship started there, and then I've gotten to know you more working here as you do a show every week on Sports Look.
Yeah, shameless self-promotion.
Well,
my program isn't as good as yours,
no,
we try our best.
No, I'm not near as polished. I learn from you, but things for our students. I mean, that's the reason I think we're here, is obviously for the students, and that's what I love about being here at the station.
Right.
So, interest in history always as children, just always there?
I taught social studies for 2 years and enjoyed that immensely. And social studies was a kind of combination of government, economics, history, geography. And my interest has continued, and caught up with Don playing basketball at Noontime Basketball.
Okay.
And we've collaborated ever since with books on the American presidents, the greatest women in American history, the most influential Americans, and the greatest events in American history. And now we're looking at Washington's generals and the people who have worked behind the scenes to support George Washington. When we talk about the American Revolution, everybody mentions George Washington first, but there were a number of people who were behind him, supported him, encouraged him, provided supplies, munitions, and all kinds of other events were going on in the American Revolution that the average student doesn't know about. So what we've tried to do in this book is look at some of the other people, Francis Marion, for example, the Swamp Fox, and some of the other great American heroes who have contributed to our American Revolution. And now we're looking at the 250th anniversary.
In 2025, that'll be the 250th anniversary of the start of the American Revolution. So we thought the timing for a project like this would be perfect.
Okay. Well, and I was actually going to ask the collaboration. So obviously your love for history and the basketball court. So
Right.
you got to be friends, and then you wrote how many books together?
This is our 5th.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And we've also worked on a number of articles. And I'll give credit where credit is due. I have never come up with an idea. All of these ideas are Mike coming and saying, hey, we ought to do this project. And I think about it and I'll say, yeah, that would be a pretty good project. So
that would work.
every article that we've jointly authored, every book, it's his brainchild. And I just try to lend whatever I can to the project.
When I was reading through some of it, something that came to mind is in modern days, we've had military correspondents that have been part of the wars, and you get newsreels and then you get footage. How did the American Revolution get recorded? So on this book, you selected, there was 77 generals, right? Is that
We
right?
narrowed it down to 24.
And
that
so
we
how
found.
did you select those? And tell me a little bit about how was their history actually recorded? And how do you, I mean, who wrote this down? How did you know about them? But how did you select them first?
I'll let Mike handle the selection.
Okay.
Well-
He's the brains behind the operation.
Well, we looked at about 20, 24. Not all of the generals, for example, stayed the entire course. Some were obviously killed in battle,
Right.
which was a great loss. But we tried to look at the brigadier generals and the people who seemed to be stellar, like Francis Marion, Harry Lighthorse Lee, the people who really made the biggest contributions to the establishment of our country and contributed the most to helping with, for example, the Valley Forge, with Washington crossing the Delaware. Obviously, there were people behind all of these events. And a lot of the history was based on kind of like letters. Don did that great Civil War book where he just looked at a whole bunch of
Okay.
letters and correspondence from people. That was their kind of record. Not all of the generals, for example, kept good records. And unfortunately, they lost out on some of the money that they contributed. But some of the things were very meticulously recorded, like the Boston Massacre, the Tea Party. Those big events were really captured by
Those,
the newspapers.
those are the things I remember from school.
Right.
You know, you have the painting of Washington crossing the Delaware
Mhm.
and the tea getting dumped over in Boston Harbor. And so when Doc had talked to me about this, I said, "Oh, there was generals besides Washington."
Oh,
And I
yeah.
was being sarcastic, but
Uh-huh.
how were the armies formed at that time? Did you enlist? Did you get drafted? How did you get?
A combination of both during
Right.
the
'Cause
American Revolution.
I never even thought to ask that when I was a
Yeah.
kid.
So what happened was when the colonies went into rebellion against Great Britain, every colony called upon its young men to enlist in regiments. Most of those became what were called the Continental Line. So there was like the 1st Massachusetts, the 5th Maryland. But there were also what we would call today National Guard. There were militia. And so they would
Okay.
only come into service if there was a
They-
direct threat
Okay.
to their neighborhood.
Okay.
But by the end of the war, some states had to resort to a draft. So many people think that the draft was just Vietnam. But no, actually, in the American Revolution, a pretty significant chunk of the American Army had been drafted into service.
And the wars then, what a different way of fighting. They literally lined up, loaded their powder and balls, took a shot, and stepped back if they didn't get shot, and reloaded, and the next one went forward. So it would be kind of tough to sign up for that. And I have read that actually, guerrilla warfare
Mhm.
came about the Americans in the American Revolution. Is that true?
That's correct. Francis
Okay.
Marion was probably the exemplar of that. He would attack, retreat, go into the swamps. And they actually sent someone over from England to try to find Francis Marion. They called him the Swamp Fox. All of these generals, some of them had distinguishing names that really brought them out as heroes, as
Okay.
icons. And Francis Marion was almost the exemplar of this militia type of guerrilla warfare where he would attack, retreat. You may have seen that movie, The Patriot. That's
Yes.
kind of loosely based on Francis Marion, although
Okay.
Hollywood took a lot of liberties with that, as you probably can guess.
Entertainment.
Entertainment. But I think Mel Gibson kind of portrayed the attack, retreat, lure them in, and then kill as many as you could. And this is where the Americans, because they had the lay of the land, the British did not know the geography of the 13 colonies. It's kind of like a home court advantage. The Americans had the home court advantage in the 13 colonies.
Okay.
They knew the land where the British did not know. what was really going on. They may have had a minuscule idea about the Hudson River, which is a focal point, but they really did not know the lay of the land. And that's where the Americans had the advantage.
And we didn't play by the rules that they were accustomed to. Because
Right.
typically in other wars, the most people probably won. You had the last man standing, and
Yeah.
that's what a way to fight.
Uh-huh.
And that actually, at the end of the American Revolution, it was because we had learned to fight as a conventional army that we were able to trap the British in Yorktown and force the surrender of the British Army. But Mike's point is well taken. The first British Army that surrenders in North America to Horatio Gates at Saratoga, that was fought a lot by guerrilla warfare, by militia coming up, knowing the lay of the land, and denying British access down the Hudson River, which is their intended destination.
And we also had the help of the French.
That's right.
I mean, obviously,
Lafayette.
France didn't have any great love from Great Britain. They were all after putting in colonies all around everywhere. And so,
You mentioned an important thing, and that is the help that the Americans got from European countries. And you
Mhm.
mentioned Lafayette from France.
right,
There was Kosciuszko from Poland. There was de Kalb from Germany. There was Pulaski from Prussia and von Steuben from Prussia. So we got a lot of support from European countries in various ways: military, monetary, naval
naval.
assistance also. So we have a great deal of gratitude to show to these various people like Lafayette and Kosciuszko and Pulaski.
The other thing that I found interesting was the fact that there were a number of American generals who had actually been British officers during the French and Indian War,
Right.
had served in North America, but liked what they saw over here so much that they left the British Army, became residents of the colonies. And then when the colonies went into rebellion, even though they'd only lived here for 10, 12 years maybe, they decided that their loyalties were with the colonists and they fought against the country they had served during the French and Indian War.
Forming their own type of government and a different way of life, and the difference of England's set patterns of lords and very different,
Nobles.
and to be able to keep a little more of your own money and be basically innovative.
Yeah,
much
money
different-
was obviously a big issue. You've all heard about taxation without representation. And that was one of the biggest things. And obviously the Stamp Act and these other monetary things that they were putting on the colonies and the 13 colonists. This was a big issue that prompted the fighting, so to speak, as well as the Boston Massacre.
Okay, all right. So when you settled in on your, do you have a favorite or one that you felt that was most impactful? Or I know you wrote in the part of the entry, and we should do this. We should actually show this is your book that you have wrote. So
And we have pictures with every single one of the generals that supported Washington to give people a visual,
sure,
to give them a feel for these generals. In answering your question about who is my favorite, I think Francis Marion, because
Okay.
early on, Walt Disney many years ago did a series honoring Francis Marion, the Swamp Fox, and his various challenges and what he had to face, keeping the men involved and keeping them going toward what seemed to be an insurmountable thing. People did not think that America was going to win against the British,
no,
because Britain was commander of the
Was huge.
seas. They were huge at that time. So it was just interesting that the Americans, with the aid of Lafayette, Pulaski, and the other European people, were able to pull this off. Washington, as a strategist, maybe did not think that they were going to outrightly beat the British, but maybe that the British would ultimately give up and go back home.
or at least give a compromise or something.
Right,
that would
negotiate
be
some type
treated
of
better.
thing, allow them some representation in England. They were hoping for some type of mutual kind of consensus for this event.
And for you, Doc, one that was really interesting or intriguing on the history and why they chose to be so involved?
For me, Nathaniel Greene is clearly the general that we need to know in addition to George Washington. Greene was a Quaker. And Quakers, of course, because of their beliefs, they're not compelled to serve in the military, and nobody expected him to serve in the military. But he felt that this was such a just cause because he was a merchant in Rhode Island. He had seen what the ruinous taxation policies were doing to the colonies, and so he wanted to take an active part. But he also had some sort of congenital leg problem that left him with a limp. So he didn't seem like a soldierly type because he was a Quaker. He didn't really look like a soldierly type because he walked with a limp. But he's with Washington at all of his important battles. When things look really dire for the American cause at Valley Forge, George Washington asked him to become the quartermaster general and get the supplies that the army needs to stay alive. And even though Greene had no experience with that whatsoever, he proved to be an excellent quartermaster general. After the situation fell apart in the American South, which is where Francis Marion comes into the story, Washington had Greene go down to the South. He managed to stabilize the situation and actually lured the British out of the South up to Virginia so that they could be trapped at Yorktown and lead to the surrender that really guaranteed our independence. So Nathaniel Greene, to me, is if there's only one other person in addition to George Washington, I like Francis Marion because I watched that TV program. Leslie Nielsen, interestingly enough, was the actor that played Francis Marion in that series.
Not an what was his
airplane and the Naked Gun, and
you would never think of him as a serious actor.
No, but he was back in the 50s. He was definitely a serious actor. But so Francis Marion, Nathaniel Greene, those are two individuals that we definitely think will shine out in the book.
It's interesting when you talk about the supply. They actually have a degree now that's supply engineering. You know, how do you get things from one place to another?
Right.
So you think about this, the food and just the basic necessities of human beings in a place that wasn't real organized. So what they were eating or what they were wearing or their health, their medical care, pretty limited.
Or Henry Knox, who transported 55 pieces of artillery from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York to Boston, where there are no roads, there are no railroads, there are no canals. He just figured out a way to move them overland so that George Washington could use that artillery to force the British out of Boston in March of 1776.
And I'm going to venture that our naval was not real strong.
No.
So that was a huge part of the French, of being able to get supplies up and down the coast.
A general named John Glover was actually almost the beginning of our American Navy. He had a ship named after his wife, whose name was Hannah.
Okay.
And he also helped George Washington with the crossing of his men across the Delaware. So this is a small name that no one has really heard about. And part of the book is to emphasize some of these people who contributed greatly to Washington and to the American Revolutionary cause.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, when I started reading through this, I thought there's so much that you don't even think about the questions. You take things for granted in today's society. Transportation and the meals ready to eat and the things like that our people have now. And logistics was huge.
Yeah, some of the names continue on. For example, Benjamin Lincoln. Now, we all know about Abraham Lincoln, and whether they are related or not is up to genealogists. But then you have Daniel Morgan, who was supposedly a cousin of Daniel Boone. We have Henry Knox, maybe Fort Knox was named after him. So the names permeate our American culture, so to speak.
That they carry on.
Yeah.
And speaking of names, one of the other interesting generals is a guy by the name of George Rogers Clark, who with 200 Virginians gave America a claim to the land all the way out to the Mississippi River by going out into the frontier and capturing the 3 important British forts. And nobody knows him today because he had a younger brother by the name of William Clark, who became part of Lewis and Clark. And so he definitely gets overshadowed by his younger brother.
He doesn't have arches in St. Louis.
No.
Okay.
And Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, his youngest son, went on to become General Robert E. Lee in the Civil War. So by tracing some of these great people, we can see the intertwining of some of our greatest American heroes.
That's really cool. So I'm going to go back a little bit. When you started writing, learning the process of how you come up with a publisher, how you have an editor. Can you delve into that a little bit?
I'll defer to Mike because, as I keep saying, he's the brains behind this operation.
Well, there are certain publishers who focus on historical matters. There are certain publishers who look for in-depth American history because they want to preserve the history, even the good and the bad. We always have to talk about, obviously, Benedict Arnold and West Point and his betrayal of the American Revolution. So there are historians all across the United States. There's historical societies over in Texas. We have historical societies that get together to discuss the Civil War, for example. And there are people who really want to delve into the rich, robust history of the American Revolution. And there's actually a little predecessor to this. Many of these generals were fighting in the French and Indian War. So a lot of them got their experience from that experience, carried over.
Okay.
And again, some of the European people went into training our American soldiers in guerrilla warfare and battlefield tactics.
And Evelyn, getting back to your original question, what's really, I think, interesting about what Mike and I have done over the years is Mike could have just come up with 24 names and said, okay, give me 4 pages on this guy, give me 4. But what we always do in our books is Mike comes up with a series of questions, and then I give an answer to those questions. So every story in here is going to be different because Mike frames their story differently. So I'm looking at different aspects of their life, trying to show how they became in a position where they could give aid to the American cause. And that's what we did with 50 Greatest Women. We didn't just write, okay, here are 50 women, here are their stories. He asked specific questions about, well, what made this person? How did this person's early life influence how she came into the picture and the role that she played? So I give all the credit where credit is due. Mike has to do the really important work to come up with the questions, and then I just figure out an answer to them.
Well, when I looked at the credits in the back of the book, obviously there is a ton of research. If you're answering his questions, you've done a very large amount of reading, and you have said the Civil War is where your passion is. Is the American Revolution yours?
Kind of, sort of.
Okay.
I think so. People have their own leanings toward parts of American history. For example, you mentioned the Lewis and Clark expedition, the Louisiana Purchase. Those are key aspects of American culture and history. The idea of manifest destiny, the linking of the East and the West Railroad. Those are some of the events that we've looked at that really formed and shaped American culture and history.
I know we haven't touched on nearly enough on the book, and we're getting short on time, but I'd like your input. We don't have history in high school near like we did. When I was there, you studied the American Revolution,
right.
you know, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Your thoughts on not having those required classes in high school? My understanding is if you don't learn history, you're apt to repeat it. So your viewpoints on that?
Well, I think you're correct.
Okay.
That if we don't learn from history, if we don't learn from World War I, World War II, we can even see some similarities, I think, with the Ukraine. If we don't stop Putin and his invasion of the Ukraine, you're going to have a domino effect. If Russia takes over the Ukraine, the next stop is Poland. That some dictators had this idea that they want to conquer the world. Maybe they've studied Caesar or someone like that. But I think we have learned not to appease, as was done in World War II with Churchill and who was it before Churchill?
Oh, and Neville Chamberlain.
Neville Chamberlain.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The appeasement idea is not a good one.
I had the pleasure of serving as a sponsor on a trip to Washington, D.C., and it was through the electric cooperatives of the state. and it was just loaded. It was 5 years of history in one
Right.
week. And we went to the Holocaust Museum,
Right.
and it's an extremely emotional and moving museum. And some of the students, we got out, and some came out with tears, and some were like, "That's the worst thing that I ever saw."
hmm
And I said, "Good, because you need to see that
Yeah.
so that it doesn't happen again." But they just weren't getting, like, you need to have that history and what it does.
And the positive I take away from our book, and I don't want to take too much of your time, but we tried to look across all of the colonies. So we try to include at least one general from every one of the colonies. We looked at generals who were there at the beginning. We looked at generals who were there at the end. And that to me is the takeaway about the American Revolution, is we had people from 13 different colonies, different backgrounds, different ages, and yet they were united by that idea that we should be a united
The
nation.
commonality of it.
And
We are Americans
we are
and that pride
Americans.
in our nation.
Yep.
Well, gentlemen, we're pretty much out of time, but it's been a pleasure. Where can we can look up and find where we can find your book. There'll be credits at the
Stone
end.
Tower Press.
Okay, so look there and you can get this. And again, it's Washington's Generals. So I know this will be a great book for you to look into. And if you have that love for history, that would be it. So a
Good
pleasure.
for Mother's Day and Father's Day.
That's true.
coming
Stocking
up.
stuffers.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, gentlemen, a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And to all of you out there, thank you for watching. We will look forward to seeing you next time. Cheers.